Hello, and welcome to the Nutrition and Life podcast. This is where we look at various nutrition and fitness-related topics through the lens of application. We want to give you practical takeaways so that you can create your healthiest, best self backed by knowledge. Now, on to the episode with your host, Coach Lisa.
Hello and welcome back to the Nutrition and Life podcast. My name is Lisa, I am your host, and today we're going to talk about all things digestion. The reason why I want to talk about digestion is because it obviously affects all of us and it is directly linked to our nutrition as well. Before we get into the episode though, I do want to ask you, if you enjoy this content, please go and subscribe, rate and review, give us some feedback, share with your friends. That is the best way for me to grow this podcast and simply to spread the message as well. So diving right into digestion, I really don't just want to talk about the foundations like, how long is your digestive tract? Where does your digestion start? And so on. I don't think that that is very helpful for you. I really want to mostly talk about things like how can we immediately relieve some pain that you might be experiencing from time to time, like bloating or being gassy. How can we generally avoid getting into those situations? How can we get to the bottom of food intolerances, etc.? I think digestion and the gut microbiome have recently gotten a little bit more traction and gathered more interest. And that is because we really are just at the infant stages of the research of it. And still we have already found out quite a lot. And especially we have found out how important it really is, how important it is in order for us to properly absorb the nutrients in our food and not just having them pass through, how important it is because of the gut-brain connection that is clearly present when it comes to digestion, how important it is for our energy levels, and most importantly, or one of the most important things, obviously also just how you're feeling on a day-to-day basis, because nobody should have to walk around with regular episodes of diarrhea or constipation. And of course, digestion is actually also very closely related to longevity, particularly the fiber aspect and the probiotic aspect, and we'll get into that in a little while also. So again, when we talk about digestion or indigestion and digestive pain, many people just say like, I'm bloated regularly, I was super gassy, it could even go down to the point of having cramps, of having actual stomach pain. And in those cases, so bloating, gassy, probably a more frequent occurrence, often when we increase protein too quickly, often if we just eat protein sources that perhaps are not that ideal for us, or maybe even if we consume too many cruciferous vegetables and beans and those things. So a little bit less of a worry, but if we get down to the pain and cramp route, it usually comes back to some sort of conditions such as leaky gut syndrome or SIBO or irritable bowel syndrome, etc. And so we do want to take a closer look at those as well, if that is something that we're experiencing on a more regular basis. The occasional constipation and diarrhea is bound to happen just with modern life. Most of us travel on a regular basis. Most of us are exposed to stress on a regular basis, and both of those are probably the biggest impactors when it comes to constipation. If someone suddenly gets constipated and they have been continuing to eat pretty much the same things, and the only thing that changed was stress, that is actually very, very common. We underestimate how much of an effect that has on our body. And it does kind of make sense, because if we're stressed, we can also feel ourselves hunching over a little bit more, being tense, so muscularly being more tense. And of course, there are a lot of muscles around our organs, around our digestive tract, and therefore it's simply not as smooth for all that food to go down there as well. And the other thing, of course, is that our body probably perceives, okay, hey, let's deal with everything else, with the stress around us first. And food and digestion sort of takes a back seat there. With diarrhea, I'm saying that is somewhat of a normal occurrence from time to time, simply because, again, with travel as well, we're exposed to more bacteria for one. We also probably often eat from different food places that we might not be so used to. So even if you just go somewhere where they have more spicy food, or using different kinds of oil and so on, all that can lead to diarrhea. We do want to note that that is not necessarily food poisoning. Food poisoning really classifies more as if you have to go to the hospital, have to have your stomach pumped, etc. So where do we even want our digestion and digestive frequency to be at? Of course, most of you know or have experienced that probably going somewhere between twice a day and every 2 days feels best for most of us. This depends largely also on food volume, and in many cases, people forget that if you drop your food volume, you're probably also going to be going to the bathroom less frequently. So people might go into a weight loss phase, and then they're suddenly like, "Oh, I'm way more constipated," or "My stool it has a different consistency as well," or "I'm only going every 2 days." And if you think about your digestive tract as a pipe, or whatever you're putting something in there. And if you're putting less in there, then obviously less is going to come out, and probably less frequently as well on the other side. That's just part of it. So if you are someone who can eat 4,000 calories, you're probably going to be going more like twice a day. And if you're someone who's in a dieting phase and you're down to 1,500 calories, you're probably lucky if you're going every day, maybe every second day. Clinically speaking, we're really only talking about proper constipation when it's, I think, more than 3 days, maybe even 4 days or so. But when we're just going every second day, that doesn't clinically classify as a constipation. I do know that it can still feel very uncomfortable, especially if it's associated with air being trapped in your digestive tract and so on. But nonetheless, still, if you're just going every second day, it's not the end of the world. I know that this is just audio, so it's a little bit difficult for me to bring up some drawings or so of what the consistency of stool should actually look like. But color is indicative, and yes, the consistency as well. It shouldn't be too hard. It shouldn't be something like rabbit poo, just little tiny things either, and it shouldn't be super watery as well. It shouldn't have a distinct or foul sort of smell with it. Of course, it's going to smell like feces, yes, but you know what I mean. There is distinct smells too if something is wrong also. So, even if this is uncomfortable, face what things look like for you, and then perhaps even just Google this and that consistency, and what's a regular consistency of stool and so on, or a normal consistency of stool. This is largely going to be dependent on your fiber intake as well. And things like alcohol really affect that as well. You probably have experienced, if you've had a day where you have had more alcohol or so, it has somewhat of a laxative effect. And speaking of laxatives, it would be ideal if we don't have to rely on taking laxatives regularly for a regular bowel movement. Many very petite females that would like to go more frequently than just every 2 days or so take laxatives on a regular basis, and I personally am not a fan of it. It's very aggressive for your gut. So even though it kind of gets things moving in terms of actual gut health, it's really not doing you too many favors. If you have to take it on occasion, that's absolutely fine. But we don't want to be reliant on it. I would urge you to look into other things, to really take certain things out of your diet, to try certain elimination diets, and to be a little bit radical with it, especially when it comes to taking out the common offenders. Again, in dieting phases, I often see that people go a little bit bonkers on the sweeteners, and while the effect of sweeteners, artificial sweeteners, and so on gut health is a topic very much discussed, and various opinions. I don't even want to go down that rabbit hole. I, for one, just want to say that for most people, in my opinion, a certain amount of artificial sweeteners is generally tolerated. However, I usually recommend keeping that to 1 or 2 servings per day. We forget that things like chewing gum includes that as well, that things like obviously diet sodas, but then usually protein bars, sometimes even in yogurt, protein powders, and so on. So the more things you can actually purchase that are sweetened naturally with stevia or monk fruit sweetener, the better it's going to be for your gut. There is definitely no doubt on the fact that artificial sweeteners are not going to have any positive effect on gut health. So why not try to limit it anyway? But yeah, often in dieting phases, we're like going from one chewing gum to another, to a diet soda, into a protein shake, into, sweetening your non-fat Greek yogurt with a ton of sweeteners to have some, get that feeling of fullness as well. But oftentimes, various sweeteners can really make us feel more bloated, more gassy, trapping air in there. And in my opinion, it's still something to pay attention to, not to the least that it also, if you always have something sweetened, you're obviously conditioning your sweet senses, and regular things like fruit are soon not going to seem so sweet to you anymore, so that you almost have to like sweeten your food sometime soon, and you're always craving that sweet hit. And it's actually a fact, you can decondition yourself from that as well as anything, you can slowly reduce it, and or you can go cold turkey, which often is a little bit more difficult, especially in a dieting phase. But yeah, so that would be point number one. Look out for the common offenders, the first one being artificial sweeteners. Aside from that, of course, most people are aware of dairy and how people can be intolerant to dairy, but also just sensitive to dairy. Oh, one last thing I wanted to say about sweeteners. So there are many, many different kinds of sweeteners, and in many cases, people are totally fine tolerating 10 certain sweeteners, and then there might be one or two that really aggravate their gut. So for me personally, I actually don't have any issues with aspartame or many of the others, but sucralose, if I'll have like a glass of diet soda with sucralose in it, I feel horrible afterwards. So if you feel very bloated or horrible after a particular food, look at the exact sweetener that it's in, and then maybe pay attention to whether it's just that specific one triggering that. But going back to the dairy, most people are aware, yeah, okay, there's dairy intolerance. I'm actually fine with dairy, blah, blah, blah. And here we still want to pay attention to the quantity, because even if you are not intolerant, you might still be sensitive. It might be better off limiting at least whole milk. Most people are fine with yogurt, and yogurt being a probiotic as well, as long as it doesn't have any added sugar in it. Is actually such a great probiotic food. So I always would try everything to keep the yogurt in there, just with the probiotic qualities, and because it's a great protein source also. But also then looking into various cheeses that can sometimes be a little bit of a trigger, and just paying attention to that. Another common offender for bloating, gas, etc. could be gluten. In my coaching clientele, I haven't observed, sorry, that many people that are actually gluten intolerant. Again, some that are a little bit more sensitive to gluten, and that tend to be a little bit more inflamed, and then keeping weight up more likely with gluten. And in my opinion, it would still be best, especially when dieting, to keep it to a minimum for most people. So basically, that doesn't mean you need to eat gluten-free bread, everybody, or purchasing the gluten-free pasta and pizza and so on. I think if we, the majority of the time, can get our carbs more from oats, rice, and sometimes oats do contain gluten, so I'm not as hard pressed there, but fruit, vegetables, and so on. Then on occasion, once, twice a week, having a good quality piece of bread, perhaps sourdough, which again is fermented and therefore good in terms of probiotics, and on occasion having a regular pizza or so, that's fine. And then just potentially acknowledging that the next day you might feel a little bit off as well. Talking about vegetables, though, there are many people that are somewhat intolerant or sensitive to cruciferous vegetables, to beans, to legumes. So even if you are fine with a smaller quantity, sometimes going into a dieting phase and people want to feel full. I get it, absolutely. And therefore they eat something that is rather filling, like cruciferous vegetables, and pile up 300 grams, 3 cups or whatever of broccoli, and then being surprised that afterwards they feel absolutely bloated and gassy. That is not necessarily advantageous for your digestive tract either. In those cases, I'd say leafy greens or greens in general, that's awesome, absolutely. But let's see that we can keep the broccoli to like 100 grams and then maybe 100 grams of spinach or zucchini or something that's more easily digestible. So don't, while, of course, as we talked about in the last podcast episode as well, while we do want to have fiber and vegetables also in order to give your gut something to work, we also don't want to overwork it. So the general recommendation, as I have mentioned before, for fiber is about 10 to 15 grams per 1,000 calories consumed. And there is going to be a large personal variance here. Some people probably better erring on the side on the lower side. Some people can probably push that almost up to 20 grams per 1,000 calories consumed. And the important part with fiber is to increase it slowly as well, and to get a good balance of soluble and insoluble fiber. The insoluble fiber is going to add a bit more bulk to your stool, whereas the soluble is going to make it into more of like a gel like paste. So when you're constipated or you have diarrhea, also look into not just, hey, I'm going to have more fiber, but look into which one might be more beneficial for you. So an example for soluble fiber would be something like oats. An example for insoluble fiber might be something like potatoes and cabbage and so on. I personally used to think that more is always better. And one day I was like, why don't I make it a challenge to myself to see that I can hit my macros on a plant-based diet for a couple of weeks. That was as I was like just starting out as a nutrition coach and as the vegan diet was really taken off. And I just wanted to see whether I could do it, because people would always say, oh, I can't hit my protein target. I'm on a plant-based diet. I'm on a plant-based diet. And so that's what I did. I really planned out my macros really well. Of course, I included a couple of protein shakes per day as well, but also tons of beans and legumes. And I made the mistake of not just easing into it. I literally swapped my diet from one day to another. I was so constipated. I cannot remember being in this much stomach pain ever since then, or even before then. Like, honestly, it was very, very difficult, and I probably had about 4 days before I had a regular bowel movement. I wish I would have noted down the exact fiber that I bumped my fiber up to. It was probably somewhere like 70, so going from like 30 to 70, more than doubling it. And it was just not good. So please, if you try to work up your way in fiber, and the general population really does have to do so. I'm making it sound like everybody eats too much fiber, and that's not the case. The general population, or the majority of people, are not getting enough fiber. So if you're someone, though, who can confidently say, I'm eating 5 servings of vegetables and a little bit of fruit per day, and a little bit of, high quality grains and so on, chances are you are hitting your fiber target. And it really does pay off to find a bit of a sweet spot there. Looking into your MyFitnessPal throughout a week or two, and just assessing where your baseline is, or where you generally hover around, and what your stool and bowel movements are at the same time. The other thing that people struggle with when trying to quote unquote eat better is that we often increase protein, obviously, because most people don't eat enough. And then with that fast increase, it can also bring up some digestive discomfort. As we talked about, protein is the macronutrient which is hardest to digest. And therefore, it's, again, more work for that little worker down there, for your digestive tract, and it just needs to get used to it. So the encouragement here is to slowly bring it up. If your protein intake beforehand was like 60 grams and your target now is 130, don't make that quick jump. And also pay attention to what protein sources you are increasing from. If you are suddenly adding in a ton more dairy and you're noticing, oh, okay, I'm really, really gassy, maybe I don't actually tolerate dairy all that well. Give it a few days though. It might just take some time for your gut to get used to it. Also paying attention, sometimes we just add a ton of protein powders or bars and neglecting the fact that that also often adds those sweeteners that I talked about earlier. So slow increase when it comes to protein as well. Another thing which can really bring up digestive discomfort is incorrect. I don't know if I can say incorrect because it's not the same for everybody, but just a meal size or meal sizes that do not fit you. Most smaller females, and this is very generalized, but most smaller females probably do better digesting more frequent, smaller meals than having a large meal in one sitting and afterwards feeling like you're in a food coma. And it's just so much work for your digestion all at once. But on the flip side, we also don't want to do constant snacking because of more of blood sugar levels and also the signal that it sends to your body to store food. But more in the sense also of like never feeling satiated. So at some point you're, especially when it comes to going into your digestive tract, we want to have a certain amount of amino acids in one meal so that you are actually registering as full and that message gets carried to your brain. That doesn't happen if you constantly just eat a tiny little bit. That message is never going to be sent because you're not crossing that threshold. So think about your meal quantity and size and frequency, and avoid having like really, really large meals in one sitting. Yes, sometimes on the weekend or in a celebration, it's kind of part of the deal that it's at least bigger than what we're usually used to. But generally speaking, keep it to a certain level that you know you do well, and try to avoid eating way too close to your bedtime as well, in order to give your digestion a chance to digest, to do its thing before you drift off to sleep. On the topic of digestion as well, I should mention fasting and intermittent fasting having gotten like a really good reputation for being so amazing for gut health as well. And there really is not that much evidence for that intermittent fasting as we know it these days, with the 16-8 sort of eating / fasting window, that has any increased benefits on your digestive health in comparison to just fasting every night for 10 to 12 hours. The improved benefits of fasting when it comes to cell autophagy, so like your dead cells being excreted from the body better and all that, really don't kick in until you fast for like 24 hours. And so the intermittent fasting, in my opinion, just for the sense of digestive health, is not a good reason for that. It has some other benefits for other people when it comes to shortening the eating window and having an easier time with adherence, but the majority of people are going to do just fine only fasting for 10 to 12 hours every night. Next, of course, when we talk about digestion, we need to talk about probiotics and prebiotics, because that's usually the first thing that people think of when it's like, oh, digestive health. Well, so what are probiotics? Probiotics are the good bacteria in our gut, which we want to have more of. And the prebiotics is the food that these bacteria feed on. We actually also have a blog when it comes to probiotics and prebiotics, which I will link in the show notes. If you're more interested in reading that, there is a little bit more detail in there. But generally speaking, many of the probiotic supplements are actually not doing anything. You really need to purchase a very high quality supplement and then still feed those bacteria very well afterwards. Otherwise, they're just going to die off. So the prebiotics, which are mostly present in fibrous foods, and therefore fiber, important, they're definitely a good thing. We don't need to supplement those, especially if you get a good variety through, again, vegetables, grains, starches, and so on. Probiotics are usually harder to come by. So probiotic food would be, like I said, natural yogurt, kefir, sauerkraut, kimchi, sourdough bread, anything that is fermented and that needs to be refrigerated in its raw state, which means that the bacteria are still alive. That will be a good probiotic. The sauerkraut that you can just get off the shelf, or also yogurts that are sweetened, usually do not have the same bacteria, or at least not the same quality of bacteria strains. So make sure it's a good quality probiotic. Unfortunately, a lot of like high quality probiotic foods like kimchi and so on are very expensive for what they are, and it's actually really, really easy to make some things like kimchi and sauerkraut yourself. I would highly, highly encourage you to look into some of the recipes. Some of them only require like 3 ingredients and maybe might be done within 20 minutes. It's just that the fermenting process obviously takes a few weeks afterwards, and it's a little bit more annoying, like checking on them and so on. I've also made kombucha, so a fermented tea before, and I loved it. It was very delicious, refreshing, and B, yeah, really, I could almost feel, or maybe it was a placebo, but I don't know, that acidity in there was helpful for my gut health. So probiotics, prebiotics, super important. I will do something, I don't know if people on a podcast do that normally, but I'll actually refer you to a different podcast on the Huberman Lab. I don't never know how to pronounce his name. And there he had a specialist on. I'll also put that in the show notes with regards to gut health. But more importantly, probiotics, prebiotics, where they talk about the importance of those, and that really the more we can get of those, the better. Prebiotics, easier to get by, but probiotics, we kind of need to make a conscious effort. So now I do still want to touch on some of the conditions that I mentioned earlier that some people might actually be suffering from, even when watching your meal size, your fiber, protein, and so on. So irritable bowel syndrome and leaky gut, both of those, like I said, tend to flare up the most when people are stressed. There are other conditions as well, but I'm just going to generally broadly talk about all of those in a blanket. And in many cases, it's actually worth doing a little bit of an elimination diet to really get to the bottom of what it is or what quantity it is. Because it might be, you might have an inkling of like, oh, I've eaten beans and I'm feeling XYZ. You might also be able to get it diagnosed and have the confirmation from a doctor, yes, you have leaky gut, but you're still not going to know exactly what foods and what quantity of foods are bringing up those symptoms for you. An example for an elimination diet is actually the carnivore diet, where you basically cut out all fibers, all plants in general, grains as well, and so on, and then giving your gut a bit of a chance to have a reset, and afterwards bringing one by one or very slowly one food back at a time. So it could be just with the carnivore, you're, as the name kind of suggests, mostly just eating meat, fish. I think eggs are allowed also. And then you are adding in, you could be starting with something like spinach one day. So things that are more easily digested, or an orange or whatever. And then slowly working your way up, keeping a food diary and examining every single thing, how it makes you feel. Not just immediately, but also 8, 10, 24 hours later. A slightly more inclusive elimination diet is the low FODMAP diet. I also have written a blog about that. So that mostly just excludes the vegetables that are really high in fiber, and mostly contains more things like zucchini. I think tomatoes or bell peppers are in there as well. And even here, after a few weeks, so giving your gut a reset there as well, bringing back the others. So for me, elimination diets should never be something that should be carried on forever, unless you're really intolerant to everything else. But it should be more of a reset and then bringing things slowly back in and really determining what quantities work best for your body. One more thing to touch on in terms of general recommendations that we hear on a frequent basis. Many people say, the more diversity, the better when it comes to fiber in particular. But we also know that when it comes to overall weight loss success, but also maintenance and so on. Eating similar things on a regular basis is incredibly helpful. I personally wouldn't stress too much about the diversity when it comes to vegetables. I would say more eat somewhat. So that the fact that you eat vegetables and enough fiber on a daily basis is the most important thing. If you only have two things of fruit and three vegetables that you like and everything else you hate and don't tolerate, stick with those. Like, don't force the diversity in there. If you're someone who can eat a little bit seasonal and, mixing things up from time to time, right now is might be plums in season, and then in spring it might be raspberries and so on. Eating seasonal is actually great. You could keep your meals and the base of your meals largely the same. So for instance, if you have overnight oats with your yogurt and your oats and like probiotics, prebiotics, etc., every morning, and you could add a slightly different flavor from time to time by mixing up your fruits, and the same with your main meals, maybe keeping your meats somewhat similar and your rice in there, and then having different kind of vegetables. So don't overcomplicate things. A little bit of diversity is good, but for me it's more important that you are consistent with your probiotics, prebiotics, fiber, and generally feeling good with your digestion as well. So on another point, or just to summarize that, I guess I always recommend bringing up protein and fiber gradually, implementing probiotics and prebiotics daily. So assess your food log, look into what of these foods are prebiotics and probiotics. And if you don't have them, I would assume that you have some prebiotics in there, but if you don't have any probiotics, then see how you can fit some of them in on a consistent basis, or actually sourcing a high quality supplement. Sticking with the vegetables that aid your digestion, but also trying to get in a little bit of seasonal variety. Find a meal timing and size that works for you, so you're not skimping too much early on the day either, just to have a really, really big dinner, but at the same time avoiding constant snacking, etc., and performing an elimination diet if needed. I know that this is getting kind of lengthy, but nonetheless, I promised you also some strategies how we can ease bloating and gas right away. So of course we don't have any miracle things here, and I'm not talking about any medication, but some things that have aided people. So usually when it comes to having a tense stomach, something that helps is warmth around there, and that could just be a warm cup of tea, ideally some with a good herbal tea, like a peppermint tea is great for your digestion as well. It might be fennel tea as well. Again, the good old housewife science there will point you into the direction of several herbal teas that are beneficial for digestion. Could also be a hot water bottle if it's really like more like cramps and so on. It could be a warm bath. So anything that helps your muscles around there relax is going to have a soothing effect. Sometimes after a really large meal eaten, we can aid that digestive process a little bit with some acidity, and that could be an espresso coffee. It could even be, and that sounds really strange, but it could even be like a little shot of alcohol. Again, sounds super strange. It has to be very high percentage though, so something like tiny little bit of vodka or tequila sometimes actually helps there. But if you don't want to take it that far, and probably a slightly more sustainable way to treat that would be also with regards to apple cider vinegar. So a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar in a warm glass of water, for instance, can also have some benefits for like getting things going down there. And talking about espresso, generally coffee is somewhat of a laxative. I find sometimes when people stop smoking, they are a little bit more backed up, because smoking also tends to be a laxative. And while we don't always want to say like, oh, just drink some coffee, you can only have so much coffee in a day, but even decaf coffee works as somewhat of a laxative. So if you have 1 or 2 cups per day to help with that, absolutely nothing wrong. And of course, movement actually helps as well. Yes, if we're totally cramped up lying on the ground and we're not going to be able to get moving, but even just going for a walk can sometimes help with constipation. Now, when it comes to diarrhea, it's much more looking into what fibers should I be eating now. Perhaps something like ground flaxseed or chia seeds sometimes can be helpful as well. There are various strategies when it comes to diarrhea, but I think most people are more likely to suffer from constipation on a more regular basis. The biggest point here, though, is stress and managing your stress as best as you can. And of course, food quality overall, like I alluded to earlier, regular alcohol consumption, regular consumption of too much greasy food, too much fast food, and so on. Those tend to be sort of the almost that feels like a stone in your stomach, and you can't really get rid of that too easily. But yes, walking, warm beverages, apple cider vinegar, or even water with lemon in it, they kind of help with that as well. So I hope you found this helpful. I hope you found some strategies to assess your diet overall to prevent constipation and diarrhea from setting in, to give your digestive tract the best environment it could possibly have, with good bacteria in it, with good food for those bacteria to feed on, so that also you optimize your gut health, gut-brain connection, and just overall energy levels, as if our gut sometimes has way too much to digest, perhaps if it's too much fiber or just too much food in one go, and we don't have energy for other things. We don't have mental energy. We don't have energy for training. And so it's actually important on that level as well, not just from a well-being or how I'm feeling, but from a performance perspective too. So before I ramble on too long about all this, I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions pertaining to this, please don't hesitate to send us a message, like I said, and don't forget to rate or review. I hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, or share the episode on social. Very much appreciated. You can also follow us on Instagram at Nutrition Coaching and Life, or head to our website, www.nutritioncoachingandlife.com, where we provide more valuable content. Have a wonderful day. Now go out and work on your best self.